It is Thursday morning in Switzerland, it's Thursday afternoon in Australia, and it's Space Café Australia time again. This Space Café Australia with Annie Handmer and the great Dr. Tim Parsons will begin soon. As always, we really appreciate your participation and your ongoing feedback. Only by your feedback we can be better and doing better in the future for you. I'm Thorsten Kriening, publisher of SpaceWatch.Global. We are a Switzerland-based online platform for information in and about space and new space activities in a geopolitical context. With Annie, we found a wonderful host, correspondent, and an awesome friend in Australia. I know many of you are already familiar with our website, our bi-weekly and daily newsletters, and the Space Café podcast. We also keep our fan shop open online for you, where you can support us actively and become a Space Watcher. The edition 1 has cool items for you, your friends, and the ones you love. Your support is needed to keep our work alive, and we do that only for you. If you have missed any of our previous web talks, we have an archive available on our website, in the events section, and on YouTube. We will host our Space Café Australia live on a regular basis. With that, my job is done, and I'd like to hand over to your host in Sydney today. Annie, over to you.
G'day Space Watchers and welcome to Space Café Australia. Here at Space Café Australia, we will share the stories of people from across Australia to document their roles in the Australian space sector. Firstly, it's important to recognise the history and the sovereignty of Indigenous peoples across Australia. SpaceWatch.Global would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I'd like to extend that respect to all Indigenous and First Nations people from around the world here today and maybe listening later. Sovereignty was never ceded. Today, I'm joining you from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I'm having coffee with Dr. Tim Parsons, the chair of the Space Industry Association of Australia, coordinator of SmartSat CRC's New South Wales Industry Collaboration Node, and chair of the SmartSat Aurora Space Cluster. Tim did his undergrad studies at Sydney University in computer science and applied mathematics, and then went on to study aerospace engineering and applied maths at Imperial College London. He worked in the .com boom, building websites and web media. He once wrote, presented and co-produced a BBC Two Horizon Films documentary called Cyberpunks and Technophobes, and he rides a motorbike. What I'm saying here, everyone, is that Tim is really cool, and I'm super excited that he agreed to have coffee with me today. Tim, welcome to Space Café Australia. How are you today?
I'm embarrassed, Annie, and with that introduction, oh my God. But no, I'm great. Thank you. Great to be here with you today. And I'm browsing the SpaceWatch.Global merch site right now, thinking about getting that t-shirt because it looks pretty cool.
It's pretty great. I've got to say, it's got this nice little logo happening here. It's also available in white, but I went with the black today because of the whole virtual background thing. So I think it was a good choice, but I could see it working on a turtleneck as well.
Look, it makes you look as if you're in zero gravity, which is what we're all about. Absolutely.
Absolutely. So look, I want to kick off by just admitting to everyone watching here that Tim and I have had coffee a bunch of times. We know each other, but I've never actually had to write a bio for you before. And this time, as I was doing a real deep dive into your history, I stumbled across that thing on your LinkedIn about making a documentary for BBC Two, which was back in, I think, 1993. And you casually drop in that you got to meet Douglas Adams, who is, of course, the creator of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And so my question for you is, how did you get involved in this? What happened? What was this all about? What is a cyberpunk and a technophobe? And why were you interested in this in 1993? And more importantly, how did you end up on BBC Two?
Well, so this is a story for all students everywhere, which is that if you're at university, if you're studying, get involved in extracurricular activities because, arguably you're going to learn almost more doing those things in those student societies than you are in that formal course. So I happened to be in a yacht club at Imperial College, which meant we went racing, basically. So we raced boats that were 10 meters or bigger. And to do that, we had to raise money because most of the really cool races were in France, right? Which is the national sport of France is racing. So we would go over the channel and try to rent boats and do all that kind of stuff. In that process, I got to meet the marketing people. I was an engineer, a computer scientist. I had no exposure to that world whatsoever, but I had to learn how to pitch for funding, how to write, a pitch document, how to then write a post-match newsletter, a whole bunch of stuff. And in the end, what they did is, this guy would be a good sucker. We'll recommend him to the BBC. When the BBC rang up and said, hey, have you got someone who might be able to do a documentary? So anyway, I managed to get through 5 auditions and they picked me. And then I thought, oh, great, that's awesome. I'm just going to be a talking head. And they were like, oh, no, you have to write the show. And you also have to decide who we're going to interview. And you're going to be the person on camera. So I got to interview Douglas Adams on that show. And in his music studio in North London, and it was a real privilege. And I also got to meet Craig Charles, who's the main character in Red Dwarf. So when you ring people up and you say, hi, it's Tim, I'm calling from the BBC, there's usually a fair bit of electricity. So that was how we got to cut through and meet some of these famous people. Yeah, that's the story.
That's like pretty awesome, but also having had a taste of the BBC Two life, what was it why didn't you stay there? Were you tempted to get involved in showbiz?
Look, I was also, infected with this disease that's known as a PhD. So I had this thing, right, which was I had to get it finished. And if I hadn't finished, I really felt like I'd have this part of my brain that would never be freed up. And then also, I was doing some pretty cool research at the time that I really believed in. So I went on secondment to the BBC from my job as a researcher, and then I came back. But what I did learn was that the space industry circa 1996, 1993, 94, 95, that kind of era, was kind of male, pale, and stale, right? It was very not entrepreneurial. It was kind of being wound down, by the accountants. And I love accountants. I think they're great, but it was being wound down by the cost-conscious folks. And a lot of the ambitious projects people had been talking about, like HOTOL, Hypersonic Wave Rider, or returning to the moon, doing a replacement for Skylab, really it was all focused on the ISS and the space shuttle, which was also struggling. So I realized at that point, wow, what's my path into this industry that I believed in from being a small child? And around that time, the .com industry was exploding. So then, in the BBC, I met people who, could not only explain science to you and explain the meaning of it, but they could also pick a celebrity to do a piece to camera in Death Valley, right? And I was so impressed with that sort of. So for me, I kind of came. I sort of realized I'm quite narrow, actually. I've been doing these very technical subjects, but I'm missing out on all this other stuff, which I think might be critical to the future of space. So I kind of took the red pill and went into the .com world and put my space dreams to one side for a while. But, I kept holding that candle all the way through. And now that brings us to, you and I talking in Space Cafe. How cool is that?
Totally. And I've got to be like 100% honest here and say I am a millennial. And so for me, .com happened when I was just a kid. And so all I know about .com, obviously I've gone and done reading and all of those good nerdy things, but really what I know about .com is that it was this crash, right? When we talk about .com, it's the .com crash, and it's kind of synonymous with the idea of overhyped valuations and of, some people making loads of money. Like my understanding is that our ex-Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, made a lot of money through .com and various other things, and other people losing everything. But also the rise of the idea of someone going to work wearing like a hoodie and jeans, and this kind of tech mindset where it's like, if you've got tech skills, you can get all sorts of jobs. But what was it like for you in that era? Because I look back on it now and I kind of see it through whatever someone wants to write about it. And I see it with the knowledge that there was this crash that happened. But when you were in it, what did it feel like? What was it like for you?
It felt like the future millennials were there walking with us, making sure that we made the right decision. No, I mean, it was, we got to experience the boom, right? So we got to experience this thing where, like you said, like there was a much more horizontal power structure in the companies that were coming through. The people who had technical skills suddenly had more power than the people who had all the money. And the people who had all the money suddenly had this thing they had a computer in their office and they had a thing on the desktop which said Internet Explorer. And they were like, what's that? Right. And so we were the people that would come in and explain not only what that is, but what that would do to the world. And yeah, I mean, people talk about the .com crash and huge valuations. Well, the valuations that people had back then, the companies that survived are now probably worth 50 times or 100 times more than they were at that .com crash. And, a lot of people don't realize that Apple, Microsoft, Google, Amazon are the richest companies in the world. Apple has more cash than most countries in the world. But back then, Apple was seen as this kind of, little, almost, kind of strange, quirky, slightly arrogant little company that eventually would go away and be, destroyed. That was how people kind of regarded them, even though people who are in the design and who were doing programming and were using fonts online, we saw them as what they became, which was they're going to change the world. So I think we saw everything that was coming and it was very exciting. And when we looked at space back then, it was very hierarchical. It was very linear. It was very waterfall, if you know project management. This idea of actually, bringing teams together to iterate in an agile fashion, to use visual language to describe end features for a product. These kinds of things were not in the vocabulary, and so I think that's what's been very exciting is seeing that .com culture, what I call .com culture, and seeing that whole thing come into space and reinvent it. Right, like it's okay to fail if you can go again. It's okay to learn by doing. It's okay not to have all the answers. And you see that with, some of the most exciting companies like SpaceX. They've flown 15 of those starships, and they're basically, at one stage, they were making one of those things a week by rethinking what's the definition of success. The definition of success is actually how fast are we learning? The definition of success is how many dead ends are we cutting off and creating a system for that. That's what we learned through that sort of digital, I guess, social movement. And, now we're speaking to you, we're doing this call on Zoom, and many of the audience will be seeing this on YouTube. Again, back in those days, YouTube didn't even exist. We didn't have the ability to send, the video around the world like we do now. So,
It's really curious that you put it that way, because I don't think I've heard someone talk about .com as a social movement. I've heard it talked about in terms of, this is an economic thing, or this is some sort of tech boom and the creation of a whole industry and a whole lot of capability and technology and stuff. And of course, it makes perfect sense to me that there's also a social element to that. And in a way, as you say, a stripping away of the power hierarchies that had defined old space, which now, as we look to new space, or what we're doing now, it makes a lot of sense to me that there's this cultural shift where maybe it was pioneered through .com. Maybe some aspects of that went wrong, and some aspects of that were a bubble that popped or crashed, or however you want to put it. But the boom actually carried through. And if I might use a really nerdy analogy here, which just sprung into my brain, it's kind of like how in New Zealand they did the Lord of the Rings films. And before the films were done there really wasn't much of a film industry in New Zealand. There were a whole lot of industries that didn't exist that were created through this massive injection of money. And suddenly, it seems like all of New Zealand had to dress up as an orc. And that required people to spend years building armor and learning how to do all of this special effects, digital recreation stuff. And as a result, we now have a really flourishing film industry in New Zealand. And that's the sort of thing where I'm thinking, okay, so maybe with .com, like there were lots of things that we look back and we think that was a really silly company that didn't need to be valued at that rate. Like obviously that was going to go wrong. But at the same time, there's people like you and others, you know, like so many of you who came through that, learned a lot from it, and then are bringing that now to other things. And maybe the equivalent is we're now bringing that in Australia towards the space sector and really transforming it. Do you think that's a fair comparison?
Look, I think there's a deeper truth to what you're saying, and I think there's also a twist to it, which is really interesting and intriguing, which means, you know, hopefully lots of opportunities. So the truth to what you're saying is, yes, you know, a little country, New Zealand, had somebody who just dreamt really, really big and went for the big pitch. You know, they said, to hell with it, I'm going to pitch not just one movie, but 3 movies at the same time, and the budget's going to be this big, and got the nod, right? And so I think that thinking about scale and really backing ourselves as a country to say Australians do scale very, very well. And then, you know, triangulating back into .com, like Australia has created 2 to 3 $100 million internet software type businesses every year for about the past decade, right? For the past decade, we've created 2 to 300 million dollar companies a year. Some of them have become multi-billion dollar a year companies like Atlassian, Canva, Safety Culture. Those are names that roll off the tongue very easily. They're now global names, household names. I think the thing that's next is, okay, deep tech. Deep tech is what we've been doing is we've been rethinking how we do much more complex products, which involve real scientific and technical insight to them. And so it's actually, you know, with software, you can spin up a website in a matter of minutes using an online cloud platform. With a piece of hardware, you know, if you want to go from a piece of, you know, metal or wire to micron precision, actually, that is a hell of a lot harder. And in fact, you may need to send somebody to like Switzerland, for example, like one Australian company that I know did, and actually learn how to become a Swiss watchmaker to pull that kind of precision off. So one of the things we're now grappling with is how do we fuse this let's, you know, learn fast and break things culture with some of these challenges of deep tech and deep tech research, and how do you spin some of that amazing scientific capability into an actual product that somebody wants to buy. And so there's this equally kind of intimidating mountain that we need to climb. Like back in 1996, 1995, 96, at the beginning of that internet age, we just saw this intimidating mountain. You know, how are we going to build this future? What's it going to look like? We're going to start with the web, but then what? I think we're right back there now in the Australian ecosystem where we're saying to ourselves, we have this extraordinary research infrastructure in this country. You know, we're you know, often in the top 5, if not the top 3 in particular areas. Optics, you know, biotech, quantum computing, astronomy, radio transmission. You know, we invented huge amounts of things like photocopier, Wi-Fi, the flight recorder. These things were all things that were originally invented in Australia, but commercialized elsewhere. So now what we're trying to figure out is, okay, how do we actually create leapfrog technologies and get them flown in space so that we can be a player at that top tier in making subsystems, making spacecraft, putting together full space missions? How do we leverage, for example, the fact that Australia has 70% of the world's robotic trucks in our mining sector? How do we leverage the fact that we have the most advanced companies and operations in the world for really high latency, human in the loop, semi-autonomous robots, right? We actually are the most advanced country in the world for some of that stuff because of our mining industry. So that's the challenge that we're now kind of facing. And then finally, how do we bring the best of old space? How do we bring the real lessons that have been learned by those old space folks and Australians who are scattered all over the world in those companies everywhere? And how do we fuse that with that new space, moxie, that we can do it, we're going to do it, we're going to make it better, cheaper, faster, which your generation, will want to be part of, right? And we'll be the CEO of. And, I should really be sending my resume to you, because I'm pretty sure I'll need to get a job with you at some point, because, I'm really good at sweeping and tidying up around the office.
It's true. There's a lot of enthusiasm. There's a lot of interest. There's a lot of drive. I mean, when I look at people coming out of university now as graduating from those aerospace engineering degrees, they're raring to go. But the difficulty, and the thing that I'm not necessarily concerned about, but an area that I think there's a question that still needs to be resolved is, are we ahead of our time too far? Are we so far ahead that there isn't, in fact, yet a customer for the sorts of products and services we can provide? I mean, with the new space boom that's happening, how do we make sure, and what's the role of government there in ensuring that we don't have that kind of crash that comes when people say, well, hang on, we can do all of this stuff, but do we actually want to? There's this tendency, I think, among consumers and even companies where, even though there's tools that exist that are far superior that they could be using, they stick with the stuff that they know. They stick with what seems safe. So how do we balance that? And especially in Australia, where we've got the added component of this element of what I might say is a little bit of cultural cringe, this idea that, maybe we can't really play with the big players. Maybe we're just, we're sort of there, but are we there, and should we be there? Like, how do we overcome that and address those risks and have a realistic approach to it?
Look, I think you're asking all the right questions, and I'm not just going to give you a pat answer. I think what's powerful, and it's a testament to your power of observation, that actually those are the questions that a lot of folks are asking. Although I think there are also folks who've had experience working around the world. I've been fortunate enough, thanks to the internet industry, to work, around the world in big scale endeavors, who recognize that actually, if we do decide to compete, we usually do really, really well. We just have to decide to compete. I think the other bit of interesting intelligence that I've had is I also do some work with Euroconsult. So I'm now representing Euroconsult in Australia. And they've given me a sense that actually, we've been criticized internally. A lot of people in Australia don't think we're spending enough money. And the view from outside of Australia is actually the trajectory you're on, the amount that you're spending right now and the rate at which it's increasing feels about right to avoid that crash problem. Okay. And in fact, what's happening in the larger frame globally is an acceleration of, the tempo of everything. So, previously, for example, Arianespace in a recent interview talked about how they used to do 10 launches a year. They thought was a lot. And that was just absolutely booking for them. And now they've realized that they're going to have 1,200 OneWeb satellites to get into orbit a year. Right? There's 3 coming off the production line every day in Florida. And then there's a series of upgrades that they're going to need to fly all those spacecraft every year. So they're having to rethink the pace at which they go. So I think actually our timing, you could argue late mover advantage is actually a really good strategy. And in fact, that's one of the lessons from the .com, right? Like Google was the last search engine, you could argue. And therefore they're the ones who kind of cracked it. So I think there's a last mover advantage. And, we do dominate certain industries globally. The mining industry, we kind of dominate that. We control 1/6 of the world's media industry through Beyond, the Fox organization, and a number of other Australian, owned and controlled media companies that have huge networks all around the world that create content. So there are a lot of buildings all across Southeast Asia and China that have been designed and built by Australian architects and building companies, and of course we are a country that is part of the Five Eyes Alliance. So we have access, we're a very rich country. So I think, just as you pointed out, if we get over that cultural cringe, that chip on our shoulder, and actually say we can compete. There's cool people like Torsten and his crew who kind of want to hang out with Aussies. You know, that's a pretty cool advantage that we have. How do we leverage that? And then I think you know, continue to ask the questions you're asking to forewarn ourselves about, okay, how do we mitigate that risk? What measures should we take? At what point should we double down and go for, you know, put everything on black? Those are the kind of questions that we're kind of thinking about.
Yeah, for sure. And people like you with that experience to have that judgment, I guess, in these cases, is really valuable that we have that exchange between eras, if you like, between as their cultural shift and exchange happens from generation to generation. It's important that we do that. And what you say, I think, is quite right. I mean, I think I've been wrong about this. I've been sitting here thinking, oh, well, you know, are we being first movers? It's a good point. We're Australia. We're not first movers. Everyone else has been moving on this stuff for a while. It just feels new to us. So, no, that's a really interesting point. Now,
and we have to be careful when we say that too, right? Because we were actually the third country in the world to launch a satellite into orbit. So, you know, we just parked it for a while. Yeah.
That's true. That's very true. I've got the book behind me, Kerry Doherty's History of Space in Australia. So if you haven't read that one, it's well worth a peruse. So I hate to tell you this, Tim, but we're in a cafe, as you can see, and we've actually got people listening in. And one of our people who's eavesdropping on the conversation has a question. Yeah, I know. I know this is going to shock you. So, yeah, this is me attempting to do like a sort of nice BBC transition. So Philip Merrick asks, I'm not sure if it's a greater or lesser concern than a crash, but the grab and exploitation thing concerns me. And we've got a question here. They're saying that Starlink is one example. So, you know, how do governments and people, and I guess corporations too, work together to ensure equitable outcomes, which I think leads me down a new path of discussion with you, which is really around, okay, so let's say we're doing the space thing and it's all great. Well, why are we doing it? Who are we doing it for? And what sort of ethical considerations should be guiding what we're doing and the way that we're engaging with that? I suppose another way of saying that is kind of what's the point of space like? And this brings us back to the idea of the mission to planet Earth. So all of this is an excellent segue. So what's your thought on that initial question around how do we work with people to ensure that we do have equitable results from our involvement with space?
So I'll make a sort of a meta comment or meta observation, you know, as a Gen X, right? So I'm like the bridge generation, which is that the fact that, you know, people are starting to ask these questions, the fact that people are starting to worry about this sort of stuff is indicative of the fact that space is becoming important to everyday life, and it's becoming important to human rights. It's becoming important to, you know, income inequality, as well as the north-south divide, all these things, right? So I think that there's a huge amount of incredible benefits that space has given us. There's that, you know, one of the things that military space has given us is GPS. Bill Clinton decided to open up GPS and remove the restrictions on the accuracy of GPS because he believed that it would transform the world. And here we are, fast forward some 20 odd years, and if you turned off GPS tomorrow, just in the UK, that would cost the UK economy £5 billion in 5 days, right? That's a staggering dependency that we have. So I'm hoping you can still hear me okay, because, you know, we're going through the internet. Okay. So that this dependency, but also the amount of applications that have been unlocked by GPS. Similarly, just recently it was estimated that the Earth observation sector contributes about $4.5 billion a year of value to Australia, just in the way that people are making better decisions, they're managing disasters better, they're assessing risks better, they're understanding our footprint, the footprint of our agriculture, our mining, the way we're using land, the way we're, you know, in some cases we're degrading natural systems, we're reducing the value of our natural capital. And before we had space, people didn't understand the concept of planetary boundaries. People didn't understand even this idea of natural capital, where you say, every business in the world is a subsidiary of nature. And if you run down that natural asset, then eventually you're going to have a much, much deeper crash. So for me, we're asking the right questions. I think that there are, people who are, who are doing things like Starlink, like OneWeb. There's a bunch of them coming out. We're expecting another 1,000 plus Earth observation spacecraft coming out. So we're in a messy stage, very much like the early days of the internet. And so I think that is going to ramp up the pressure for the world to actually come together and start to say, okay, what are the kinds of things that we should do together to make sure that we protect the commons? People are quite cynical about this, but I think people forget that in the past we've had big international agreements that have been incredibly successful, like the agreement to eliminate CFCs. Didn't make a headline pretty much anywhere, except it was incredibly successful at dramatically reducing the amount of CFCs we were putting into the atmosphere, which was damaging the ozone layer. So I'm a glass half full kind of person. I believe the kind of problems we're seeing, the kind of stories we're starting to see in the media, just overnight, we had a story about a 5mm hole discovered in the Canadarm, right? That had obviously been created by some space junk. I think we're going to increasingly see people seeing business and impact opportunities, both for profit and also for impact opportunities, in resolving some of these challenges. And so I'm optimistic that as a species we can come together and we can also work out what's cool and what's not cool about some of the things that we're proposing. I think that it's not going to be neat and tidy. It almost never is. It's always a bit messy. And so, but on the other hand, if Elon Musk, in the process of doing Starlink, manages to reduce the cost of launch by 1,000x, which is what he's on track to, then it'll make a hell of a lot easier to mitigate the problems of Starlink if you can launch a similar Starlink on his rockets for a fraction of the cost. So I can see personally that I'm optimistic that where we're heading is going to be very different. And I think all countries, and Australia in particular, we need to work on building our own ladders into space. And at the same time, there are these incredibly disruptive moments that we're going to see, where the disruptive to the economics, disruptive to the barriers, where folks should be able to say, okay, I can now democratize access to Earth observation imagery. Something a lot of people might not know is that Google Maps was originally invented in Sydney, and was the company that did that. Yeah, the company that did that, which was we're a very intercultural company. Two South African guys. One of them had a Cuban girlfriend, and they realized they couldn't move to Silicon Valley because he had a Cuban girlfriend. So they said, let's move somewhere else, which is a pretty cool place with technology and technical know-how. They came to Sydney. They created a company that invented what became later Google Maps, and Google acquired them. So that's the kind of thing where without because of the democratization of sort of space imagery, the increasing kind of release publicly of Landsat imagery, Sentinel imagery, other sources of both public and private data, eventually Google was able to create Google Maps and Google Earth, which again has sort of transformed so much. So I think as I said, I'm a glass half full kind of person. What role can Australia play in bringing out those, bringing out those more equitable outcomes? That's the question I think we need to work on. And JM, thinking about your question about IP, I think that government policies are thinking a lot about IP. They're also thinking about how to make sure that is GPS, for example, a human right? Is it right that AIs make decisions and maybe don't have to explain why they made a decision? Thanks heavens to the European Commission for writing legislation that said that any decision by an AI has to be explained and it has to be explainable. So, I think there's going to be this, back and forth. The fact that you're asking these questions and you're knowledgeable, I believe that's going to protect us in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting one, because when you talk to someone who's outside of the space sector, which I try and do every now and then, because it's, it's very easy to end up just chatting to each other and having a great time. When you talk to other people, you get a sense that there are differences in opinion as to what we should be doing in space, even whether we should be going to space. Some people would listen to that and say, well, sure, the cost of launch is going to go down, but why launch in the first place? On the other hand, that kind of public view, especially around things like data privacy, is driving the creation of stricter legislation and harsher penalties on issues of data privacy. I mean, we've got the EU's regulations that came in 2018. I think Australia is actually in the process of doing a review of the Privacy Act, which hopefully will be updated soon. I think there were some 2020 delays, like with everything else. So, yeah, and in the US, we're seeing big fines coming out for people. So this is a really interesting area to look at, which I suppose the other thing that just springs to mind, and a small shout out here for Australia's role on the international stage, is that in about 30 minutes, Professor Stephen Freeland will be co-chairing the international discussions on resource use and exploitation in space for the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space legal subcommittee meetings, which are being held online this year, which is really exciting and a great opportunity for everyone to get together and discuss all of this. And maybe it's just also that these sorts of regulatory things, these sorts of processes by which we rein in our instincts to go forth and do things we don't actually want to be doing, are happening. It's just that they happen slowly, and they don't have the same sort of media savviness, I suppose. I mean, I've never seen UN Coppius have an ad run somewhere in the same way that, say, mining companies do. Mining companies spend all this money on marketing, being like, we're working together to have a greener future or something like that. Whereas the UN Coppius don't spend money saying, we're working together to try and figure out all of those questions that you have. So maybe there's an awareness thing there, or maybe we do need to be doing it better. I'm actually not sure, to be honest. This is something where I'm not sure there is a really easy answer, but I definitely feel that as the millennials come of age and as the Zoomers, the generation under me, grow up, there is increasing pressure on governments and companies to be socially responsible, not just as an add-on or a marketing strategy, but actually as a big part of what they're doing. And I really feel that will flow onto space. If it hasn't already. Arguably it has. What do you think, Tim? I'm rambling here. I'm trying to solve the problems of the world, but I'm not sure I've gotten any closer. But I've had a good time.
No,
so what do you think?
I enjoyed listening to you. I think that honestly, the beautiful thing is that people are starting to have the data about modern society, right? So the post World War II era and where it's settled has actually enabled a complete close, a set of data around the things that enabled companies to survive or thrive through adversity, right? Which is all around corporate resilience. And guess what? The companies that had diverse decision-making processes with different ages and genders, the companies that thought about sustainability, the companies that looked at their employees, looked at their customers and thought, well, they're just as important as the shareholders, those companies did better, right? So now you've got a situation where, the most evil capitalists in the world, you could argue, someone like BlackRock, is actively voting people onto the boards of mining and fossil fuel companies to get them out of fossil fuels, right? They're actually, they're not dumb. They're like, if we keep, so the companies and the people that were, sort of trying to create doubt around climate change or trying to cynically slow down our transition to a sustainable economy, and even some people in the green movement who've been kind of dumb in trying to shame workers in those industries, right, who have done so much to create our society. That dynamic has to play out, and it's playing out now to, the folks who are smart about real company value or real value of a company that's not just financial. It's also social. It's also sustainable, right? Those folks are starting to have the data to make better decisions. And space has been part of that. Space is now telling us that these are the planetary boundaries. Space is telling us, yes, the first thing that really changed the world was that photo from, space had already changed the world in lots of ways, but really changed everyone's lives, I'm told, was a photo taken by Apollo 8 before I was born, in fact. And that was the Earthrise, which is the first time anyone had captured a photo of the entire Earth with like the lunar, regolith beneath it. And that was, a lot of people talk about this, that was the birth of the environmental movement. In Australia, we're a very big country. We represent 1/6, 1/7 of the world's surface area if you take our full kind of search and rescue kind of footprint into play. And so I think one of the things that, we think about as outdoorsy type people, Australians, is we actually think about the limits increasingly. Whereas in the past, we would have just looked at that far distant horizon with the shimmer of light, we would have looked at that and said, oh, it's a big world. She'll be right, mate. Now we're like, okay, heck, we got to measure 60 different parameters from soil carbon, soil pH, right through to, the number of beneficial insects sitting in that stand of trees, right through to the evaporation rate on the Murray-Darling River and everything in between. We need IoT everywhere so that we have ground truth, space-based proxies. And beautifully, the cost of that is falling dramatically. I think the key argument that I also sort of enjoy people trot out is, why are we spending all this money on space? It's so much better that we spend that money on the Earth. And it's kind of like, do you think we load the rockets up with dollar bills and set them on fire to get into space? Right. So first of all, the money is spent on Earth, and all those people pay taxes. That's the first thing to remember. And then the second thing is that even the biggest space budget in the world, NASA, that space budget is still less than a fraction of a percent of the US education budget. So as a proportion, the per capita spend on space is actually very low. I think Australia, we're spending around $10 per capita per year right now on space. It's not much, right? Other countries are spending more like $25 per capita, $50, $100 per capita, which is probably a few months worth of visits to McDonald's for you and I, right? So I think the important thing is that actually we spend more money on things that we are spending that money on really important things like education, like environmental restoration, like rethinking how we grow our food, like making smarter, better regulations. We are spending that money. Space makes those things even better because it is the ultimate high ground where we can get things at scale. So that's kind of my why space. And I hadn't even mentioned the fact that how cool is it that, we're going to go to the moon and Mars and all the problems that will entail. How many things will we learn about human beings who have to live in space in zero gravity for perhaps years at a time on Mars, much more extreme environment even than Antarctica? What will we learn that we can then bring back to the Earth to help with pandemics, with cancers, with aging, with infant mortality, with incredibly debilitating genetic diseases? What are the things that we're going to learn from these things? And that's been the track record. So Australia, we want to be involved in all of those things with all of the guests that are watching from around the world. And I think we need you to take us there, Annie. We need to follow you. Annie is the first woman on the moon, I say.
Absolutely. Sign me. Actually, I'm not sure I really want to leave Earth, but Earth is really my favorite planet, which is why when you said you wanted to talk about this mission to planet Earth and the way that space enables us to live more sustainably and better on Earth, I was so interested in it because personally, I think this is the most habitable place in our solar system. And I know that's a really big call, but you know, I've looked at the stats on Venus, I've eyed off Mars, I've thought about Mercury, and I just think, yeah, I'm good here. But what you say there about the way that we can use Earth observation data and the fact that it means that increasingly our discussions are more data driven, I think is really important because it involves a little bit of a cultural shift. Like when I was a kid, it was the first time growing up that we had social media, for example, and there was suddenly this idea of the user of social media as the product. The idea that, you know, you're not the customer, you're the product, you're providing your data, that data has value, and you're providing it for free. Or sometimes you're even paying to give your data to someone. And of course, we do now have more regulations around how that data is stored and used and so on. But at the same time, there's got to come a point where, and this is just me thinking about it now, there's got to come a point where it becomes, okay, it's not just me and my data, it's us and our collective data. And maybe there are ways in which through the Internet of Things, which from the outset sounds kind of terrifying if you really, you know, break it down and think about it. But through that kind of connectivity, we are actually part of a planet in a virtual sense. So, you know, we're already living here. We're already part of a planet physically, but now we can measure the way in which we're part of the planet and the exact impact we're having. And that can enable us to make better decisions. I think there's something to be said for it, but I think it's really mind-bending for people who have not grown up with it. And so I will be really interested to see how Zoomers and even the younger generations coming up as I get older will think about themselves in relation to their data and the internet and space and the planet. I think it's actually much more of a cultural challenge and a cultural shift than it might seem to be. It looks like a tech issue on the outset, but it's a social issue, much like what you were saying about .com right at the beginning of our conversation. So, you know, that's just a thought, but I'm aware of the fact that we're sort of running out of time, and I'd like to ask you, Tim, as someone who's got your finger on the pulse of Australian tech and Australian space science, where are we headed in Australia? What's exciting you? What is it about what we're doing in space in Australia that you think we can, you know, give to the world? Kind of, where are we going? What's happening? Where do you see this all heading? And what are you most enthused about from a specifically Australian perspective, and maybe from that startup vibe as well?
Sure. So I'll talk a little bit about the mission for Planet Earth, which is something that I am particularly excited about, and an Australian angle. And then I'd also like to talk about the in-space economy, which I think is also very exciting, and our timing there is pretty damn good, actually. So the mission to Planet Earth is what I call it, right? It's not an official name, but one of the things that Australia has been recognized as doing, if not the best in the world, I think it's generally seen as being the top three, is something called Calval, calibration validation, which is where we've been given access to a lot of the public data sets around the world, and we've been able to integrate them into cubes that reflect, you know, that we're able to strip away all the clouds, we're able to take multiple different images from multiple different satellites, line them up perfectly, fuse them into data sets, and create that. And so there's a government department here in Australia called Geosciences Australia, which is acknowledged around the world as having done absolutely the best work anywhere in fusing multiple data sets to create analysis-ready data, right? So one of the things that excites me about that is that we think that we can play a role as Australia in actually providing that very powerful set of data which comes from, you know, our universities, that comes from our government departments, integrate that and then commercialize that so that it can scale globally. And I think that's our timing with that could be really, really powerful. And so this idea of bringing government, research, and private together to create a really exciting enterprise, which is anchored in impact, anchored in creating money for new research, as well as creating a sustainable enterprise. I think that's something that excites me a lot. And the reason that's exciting is we've got a lot of people who are looking to fly more and more and more Earth observation missions, but many of them are going to have difficulties making sure that their data is accurate. And they're also going to have challenges in that they're creating raw data sets, which actually may not be that valuable. So we're going to go through kind of a messy, almost a mini boom, I think, in Earth observation. And then I think there's going to be a soft landing where the folks that have figured out how to make those business models work will come out the other side. In the meantime, I believe they're going to create some really transformational products. I think they're going to lower the cost of carbon sequestration measurement dramatically. And so that's also going to increase the supply of carbon credits from farmers and from other environmental operations who right now find it incredibly complicated to actually issue carbon credits and have them recognized to buyers. So we're seeing in just that one area of carbon markets, we're about to see a huge spike in demand, but there's not the supply because we've made it too onerous to issue those credits. So I think worldwide space is going to become critical. So I'm pretty excited about that as just one example of the transformative power of Mission to Planet Earth. Let alone things like salt intrusion into food, some of the world's food bowls. How do we measure and mitigate for that using space technology, space Earth observation imagery? How do we also use our ability to measure things like water, right, to reduce the risk of conflict? So many conflicts around the world are around resources that are stressed, and water is one of those where people are at loggerheads. For example, right now in the cradle of humanity, there's a really scary conflict between Ethiopia and Egypt, and Somalia is in the middle, where the countries don't have a way of accurately modeling the impact of building dams upstream on the folks downstream and coming up with an agreement. And so we're hoping to see that space data could provide baseline data sets and then measurements of deltas that allow them to broker this stuff without having a hot war, right? Without displacing millions of people or causing mass suffering. So I think we've got to use space data to solve all sorts of big problems. And smarter than people than me tell me it's even been something that you can detect from space or the impacts of COVID. Looking up into space, it's not to get excited. The autonomous robotics people that we have, in particular in Western Australia and other places, they're getting great traction with the Artemis project. So we're definitely hoping to have some Australian robotics technology go to the moon. And also we have some folks who are really good at performance clothing who already flown in Melbourne, and they've already flown some of their spacesuits to the ISS. So it looks like some of the really interesting materials and spacesuits that the astronauts who go to Artemis, and that's a long way away from Earth orbit, right? So you're going to be spending months there. It could be that they're going to be wearing Australian clothing or something that has Australian clothing involved. We've also got experts in things like inertial navigation. We have some people that have got the next generation of accuracy and drift resistance in inertial navigation. We have folks who are using like Sabre Astronautics. They're using game technology and machine learning to completely transform the visualization of space situational awareness. And those folks are kind of redefining operations. And they may even be able to create the most amazing, 3D YouTube videos where we're watching in real time in 3D actual robots on the moon doing really cool stuff, or people doing spacewalks in lunar orbit. So I'm expecting we're going to see some extraordinary scenes. And I haven't even talked about communications. I haven't even talked about quantum computing. I haven't even talked about cybersecurity. There's so many areas that I think are exciting that will spin off into a broader economy. And so I think it's an amazing moment.
I'm feeling inspired, I must say. And what's really nice about this is that I mean, one of the things that I look for in a coffee conversation with someone is that I learn things and that I come in with one perspective and I leave with something different. And for me, I came into this thinking, I think, of space as the destination, space as a location, space as something that it was still under discussion in a way. And what I've come out from this is actually space, like the internet, is very much the platform. It's the enabler. It's the way in which we get where we're going, wherever that happens to be. And we can make decisions about what that is. And we can, have discussions, and we should have discussions about what we consider to be ethical and how we want to go about it and who we want to do all this with. But the fact is that space is happening. Space has happened and space will keep happening. And, it's like the internet at this point. You've got to just roll with it and think of it in that more abstract terms, less as a place, more as a service, more as some sort of way that we all become closer together, that we all network ourselves in as a planet.
I think you're reaching for something. Shift. I think you're reaching for something very big here too, and I'll give you some thoughts. The way Hollywood thinks about science fiction, right? Is they see a science fiction movie is always about what it means to be human. The fact that it's set in the future, the fact that it's set on a distant star, distant universe, that it involves some amazing technology, they always, the scripts that get up and become the most popular movies, I would add, many of the top 10 movies of all time were science fiction movies, are always about what it means to be human. And I think, my belief is actually, some people call it the overview effect. Certainly astronauts come back very, very changed from having experienced it firsthand. I believe that not only is space super integrative, in a very technocratic way, right? In a very techie way, and a management control. We're going to, make the world better place, which is all necessary. Not only is space integrative in that sense, but I think it's also very integrative spiritually. And I think that, one of my personal beliefs, as a complete sci-fi nut, right? But is also that it teaches us a lot about who we are and whom we might become. And it is right at that nexus where I think the .com period before really did the same. It reconnected us all in this extraordinary way, and that was beautiful and wonderful. And then it led to Facebook and the insurrection and QAnon and all that. And so every time you have that, there's this light and dark. But what did we learn through that process? What have we learned? We've learned we were given more control. We always believed on that, the fact that we would have more insight, more democratization of information. And so you've got, the ability for someone to take that photo, to take a video of George Floyd, so that those police that it turns out seems killed him, that seems to be the verdict. And it seems pretty obvious from the video that that's what they did, right? But previously that wouldn't have been possible before the internet, before this technologies came along. And equally, there's, the use of surveillance, as you were saying before when you were describing IoT, the way that you spoke about it conjured up this big brother kind of world, right? Whereas in fact, what we're probably going to use IoT for is to do remote management of things like water levels and so forth. So I think, I think for me, ultimately, it may sound a little bit spiritual or religious even, and that word means reignite, by the way, bring us together, and its root form. Certainly space for me is very much about what does it mean to be human? And kids seem to get that. Kids seem to understand that. They understand that if you look at science, maths, art, history through the lens of space, it's quite amazingly integrative. And then you reflect back to your everyday life on Earth and you look up at the sky, you look around you at all the incredible systems that are operating around you, and you see those suddenly in a different way after you've thought about it from the perspective of space. That's that's priceless. That's a precious thing that we have, and I want us to do more.
Yeah. Look, this just brings me to mind of Hamlet, and the play within the play that holds a mirror up to nature, the existential fear that we have. And there's something about the internet and about space that hold a mirror up to humanity, and in particular for space, it's holding a mirror up to our planet, really, through all of the technology and all of the data, and it's making us really think about it. And that's scary, but it has huge potential, as you've shared with us. So on that note, Tim, I feel we should bring our coffee to a close. I'm sure you've got things to be getting on with. And I will hand back over
Annie.
to Torsten. But thank you so much for
fun.
joining me today.
Thank you for having me. It was a blast.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there was so much I would like to. I would like to say something as well, but you have done such a great job. So, but just a few remarks to what you just said. So, last Tuesday, I had a great chance to speak with Will Marshall from Planet about the European Green Deal. So that is absolutely amazing, where Europe is trying to set a new level of what we can do with space technology to help us. And then this Tuesday, I spoke with Thomas Schildknecht from the University in Bern about the pristine night sky. He is an astronomer, and he really put that into context, what happens at the moment. And there's, as you said, there's no black and white. And on the spiritual element, I had my spiritual moment when we produced the latest podcast that is about to release next Tuesday, so stay tuned for it, with Brother Guy from the, he is the head of the observatory at the Vatican. So, and we spoke with him about ethics and faith and all of that in the context. And that was, wow, it was really a spiritual moment. Excuse me. However, we have to go on. Thank you very much for this fantastic talk. I mean, I enjoyed it as much as I hope all of our listeners. So we have a few more events coming up for you in the audience, and of course for both of you. So tomorrow we will have the next Space Café Russia by the wonderful Elena Morozova, talking with Viktor Strelitz about ITU and spectrum resources, another scarce resource that we have. That will be in Russian, because it's Space Café Russia. So next week I speak, in my 33 minutes, I speak with another Australian, at least immigrated Australian, Dr. Cassandra Stair, in the Canberra University, I think, about equality and diversity in the space sector. I think a very important topic as well. On the 10th of June, the next Space Café Moribas Vox Populi is coming up, about space tourism. So we have, he has Katie Coleman, Deborah Sass, and others on his, Sarah Jane Pale, of course, from Australia, on his panel. And a day later, so on the 11th, we have our next edition of the Space Café Benelux by Banu and Chiara. And they have Simon van den Dries, the managing director of Spire Maritime, in their talk. And then I will close here with my talk with Professor Kazuto Suzuki from Japan on the Japanese space policy on the 15th, and then another Space Café Canada is coming up by Dr. Jessica West, and she will talk with, and that's a spoiler, Tim Copra. So another astronaut in the talk. All events are going to be online on Eventbrite. As always, we would like to hear your feedback, so please check in with us on Twitter, on Facebook, or LinkedIn, or send us a pigeon or postcard. That also works. Don't forget to sign up to our daily or bi-weekly newsletters, and if you like to treat yourself with something special, become a Space Watcher today. Your support will help us. Take your credit card and visit our fan shop at shop.SpaceWatch.Global. And I know, and I repeat myself, but we really need your support. That's the way it is. Thank you all very much for your interest today. And thank you, Tim. Thank you, Annie, for your debut wonderful. I can't say it in better word. I'm super excited. And yeah, thanks Tim for this exciting and inspiring talk, being our guest today, and also to the entire team behind the scenes for doing their great and fantastic seamless job day by day, week by week. Again, I hope you all will stay safe and stay healthy. And thanks for joining us. Hope to see you next week, tomorrow, whenever our next Space Cafe is. In the meantime, visit our website and follow us on social media. And don't forget, become a space watcher. Thank you very much.